and sent out representatives to explain that the rumor of more time for garden plots was false and express sympathy for those who believed the story. At first, it seemed that these measures were successful, and aside from one man of color being killed, there was no bloodshed. But then some of the enslaved unexpectedly rose up to claim more of their time in a coordinated attack on January 17th in the southeast, which was swiftly defeated by the 30th Regiment. Plantation workers across the island were involved in a larger planned rebellion, with chiefs on each plantation and enslaved in Roseau, sending news to those in the windward part of the island. They planned an attack at supper to kill their owners. The end goal was to take the windward side of the island and leave the leeward to the whites that they did not kill. So unlike many other rebellions of the period, the leaders were not trying to drive out the whole white population, though this appears a rather naive course of action, one with which Farcel disagreed. The commander-in-chief of the rebellion, Japa, who belonged to Anthony Bertrand, who was actually French, consulted with Farcel for support. Edward, belonging to Anthony's brother Charles, was another leader, along with drivers Paul and Charles. Jean-Baptiste, a freeman of color from Guadeloupe, joined Apollinaire as a leader from abroad. The accounts from white planters estimated the number of rebels as anywhere from 100 to 300. The rebels expected support of 500 muskets from Farcel and Pangloss, another Maroon chief, but they did not arrive, perhaps because of the disagreement over strategy. Leadership shifted during the different stages of the revolt. Orr's January 20th proclamation identified Farcel as the leader and offered a 500-pound reward if he was captured alive, or 330 pounds for his head. He was not captured, nor was his actual involvement clear. Then Apollinaire entered the picture as the leader, based apparently on a, quote, declaration made by a free Negro received by Governor Ord on January 21st. The assembly then offered a reward of 200 pounds for the capture of Apollinaire, dead or alive, and enslaved persons who captured him were promised their freedom. January 27th proclamation announced pardons for those rebels who returned to work within 14 days. Similar proclamations had been issued earlier. In an extraordinary measure and evidence of the desperation for information, the council revived a bill to allow enslaved and free persons of color to testify in court on matters related to the recent uprising. Or it also issued a proclamation to, quote, detain all vessels that may be discovered landing or taking anything from any of the outlays, end quote, demonstrating a concern that there was external assistance to the rebels. It also put limits on the sale of gunpowder and attempted to inventory firearms and ammunition. Two British regiments and Black Rangers were called on January 24th to put down the rebellion. Many insurgents surrendered quickly. The pardons to rebels not involved in any murder were effective, and many enslaved people returned to the plantations, rather than risk a failed rebellion in which they would surely end in their execution. The Dominican Council noted that the rebellion centered in St. Patrick's Parish and Point Mulat, known as the French Quarter. Blamed the Gazette, L'Ami de la Liberté et l'Ennemi de la Licence, sorry for my bad French, which was printed in Roseau for giving slaves the idea of rebelling, though they also blamed free people of color from Martinique. Or it seemed to blame the printer of the Caribbean Register for his incendiary editorials. This clearly demonstrates the profound influence of print culture and even a slave society because papers were read aloud. Never did the planters consider that their workers would rebel over living and working conditions, even as they feared the influence of discussions of abolition and revolution stirring around them. They had dragged their feet on passing the ameliorative legislation pushed by Ord, though an act for the encouragement, protection, and better government of slaves was passed in 1788. Ord identified two separate rebellions, one led by Farcel and one by Apollinaire. Based on the testimonies of Apollinaire and the enslaved rebels, Farcel seems to have been aiding the revolt planned before the middle of January, after which Apollinaire took over leadership. The two didn't work together. They had different goals rooted in their positionality in the colonial system, one technically enslaved but a fugitive, and the other free and a revolutionary emigre. The testimonies from enslaved conspirators indicate that Farcel wanted to kill all the whites to achieve freedom for laborers, not just 3 days of their own per week, and certainly not a shared island. As Farcel told the enslaved, The whites would never allow reduced labor on the plantations. Apollinaires' plan for up-Indian white supremacy in favor of the mixed race class could never succeed with whites on the island. We know from the letters and accounts that British and French enslaved and free people of color were involved from Dominica and neighboring islands. Some joined the rebels and others aided the government. There was no unity among the enslaved, just as there was little among the white population except in the moment of slave rebellion. Apollinaire was captured on February 1st, based on information a Kalinago man gave to Lieutenant Governor General Bruce. Those accused of participating in the revolt were put on trial and, based on the list or sent to Secretary Grenville, 19 rebels were executed in February and March. At Apollinaire's trial, he pled not guilty, and the jury found that, despite being French, because Apollinaire had taken the oath of allegiance, he could be convicted of, quote, levying public war against the king by riotously assembling armed, etc. In what Honeychurch describes as an execution, quote, designed to be a stage-managed drama of psychological warfare, end quote. On March 7, 1791, Apollinaire's sentence was carried out in result, a traitor's death. And you can read the gory details there. It's a traditional execution for a traitor. The drawing and quartering. Symbolically, his execution was the last and occurred around the same time as Vincent Ogé's and Sendemen, both of them fighting for the place of free men of color in the colonial order in an age of revolutions. Using the information Apollinaire gave in his, quote, voluntary account, right after he'd been sentenced to death, leaders were rounded up and troops and Black Rangers scoured the forest looking for maroon camps and apprehending runaways. Apollinaire's brutal death, like those of his supporters, was meant as a warning against further rebellion. Their bodies were displayed around the island along roads traveled by the enslaved. Ord considered the number of executions, quote, an example sufficiently awful to answer every purpose of justice and of true policy, even in this country, end quote. 12 more rebels had been condemned to die, but Ord recommended banishment instead and requested the king's clemency on their behalf, which was granted. He referred to the enslaved rebels as, quote, deluded wretches for believing a false rumor. Because the revolt had not unleashed mass violence like the original plots planned, he thought, quote, some lenity towards them justified. The banishment no doubt felt like death to many, as it was not an escape from slavery, but to a new unknown colony and enslaver. The West India merchants and planters in London blamed the revolt on the new language surrounding the debate over the slave trade, as unfree laborers pursued what they considered rights. Honeychurch asserts that news of the New Year's Day revolt derailed a bill in Parliament for ending the slave trade. Writing to Secretary Grenville after the slave rebellion had been quelled, Ord conjectured that perhaps the late uprising, quote, was the effect of an idea of liberty, which was for some time past prevailed amongst them. Of the same situation of the foreign and neighboring islands, and of the bad example and general relaxation of the laws that had lately been given and permitted there. The often intransigent and divided white population had made revolutionary influences from neighboring islands all the more dangerous. Although incidentally, in March, Ord was presented with a petition thanking him for his actions in the recent rebellion, signed by 230 free inhabitants. Lying between three French islands, the years after the start of the French Revolution and the 1791 slave rebellion were marked by anxiety over events in neighboring islands and the character of the refugees pouring into Dominica. In October 1792, Ord explained to Secretary Henry Dundas, quote, we are at this moment, I believe, nearly 4/5 French in the island, and our old inhabitants of that nation are infected with the mania of the new, that is, the democratic, of the remainder. A great number seem ready to attempt anything unfavorable to good order, end quote. Ord saw the benefit of granting free persons of African descent the same, quote, protection in person and property as whites in a strategic move to prevent further upheaval, even if he did not favor full racial equality. The Alien Act of 1793 was designed to prevent the residence of His Majesty's enemies in the island. Ship captains could not allow French subjects to come on land if they came into port, and any French person had to make their presence known to the governor. This soon stopped further trouble on the island. The New Year's Day Rebellion reveals a very real danger for plantation societies in the age of revolutions, as ideas about abolition and revolution circulated in the press and by word of mouth through the crews of ships and the refugees they sometimes carried. It also adds to our understanding of the repercussions of the French Revolution in the Caribbean. The incredible story of Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, is but one of many in the period, and the smaller stories of collective action by non-white actors makes for an interesting case for nodes of revolution, both connected and distinct. Islands such as Dominica, ceded to Britain in 1763, continued to have large French populations into the 1790s. They also had large free non-white populations, white-to-slave ratios that rivaled Saint-Domingue's, Maroons, and fractured white populations alongside the problem of absenteeism. And their nearest neighbors were generally French islands. The existence of a lively press and frequent mobility made it possible for French papers and pamphlets, including revolutionary and anti-slavery tracts, to be printed in British colonies. It was impossible to police people or the press, and thus the spread of ideas and rumors and the rebellions they helped fuel continued. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. So we are now moving to Felicia Fricke's presentation on the inter-island exchange and resistance against uncertainty among enslaved population in the Dutch Caribbean.
Great. I'd like to stand up if that's okay, so I can see the slides. Do I just press this? Can you make this? Oh, thanks. Cheers. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to see our presentations the morning after the conference dinner. I should first of all start by apologising for talking about something slightly different from what is in the abstract. That's because I submitted the abstract before I started my position at the NSAC. I was hoping I might have some historical information to show you from my recent research, but actually this is going to be mainly information from my doctoral thesis with a sort of in the same sea prism through which to view it. And also, this is my first ever history conference. I'm not a historian, really. I'm an archaeologist. I'm only, the past few months learning to be a historian with the help of the In the Same Sea team.
You're doing great.
Thanks. So yeah, this is going to be a little bit of a departure from maybe some of the other presentations. And yes, how do I do this? So I'm going to start with introducing this concept of uncertainty, which I think is becoming more and more familiar to us as we think about how the pandemic has affected all of our lives. But specifically to use this concept to look at the lives of enslaved people on St. Eustatius. And that's just one of the islands that I studied on for my doctorate. The other two islands that I looked at were Curacao and St. Martin, but I think St. Eustatius makes a nice case study for this. And then I'm just going to go through my theoretical approach and some of the methods that I used, which might be unfamiliar to you because they're actually from the social sciences, so they're even unfamiliar to most archaeologists. And then I'm going to talk about how this sort of played out in St. Eustatius. So, uncertainty, or not knowing for sure what will happen in the future, can have a very profound psychological effect. And yet it has something that we've all experienced over the past couple of years, not knowing what will happen with the pandemic, not only in our personal lives, but also on a national and international level. And there's a wide body of research into the psychology of uncertainty in various different fields. For example, medicine, marketing, politics, foodways, business. If you search for the psychology of uncertainty, all of these different fields come up. It's really interesting. And I think particularly in marketing, it's quite interesting how you can be manipulated by advertising using uncertainty. So, and it can also have an important effect on our decision-making process, encouraging us to be cautious, for example, or to hedge our bets. And it can also totally prevent you from making a decision, and sometimes not making a decision is also making a decision. Uncertainty can be linked to the issue of the unknowable, so it also has a sort of spiritual aspect to it as well, sometimes. And it's worth mentioning that there are various different ways of looking at slavery and enslavement from a psychological perspective. And this is research that happens today with victims of modern slavery as well. who experience many physical and psychological effects, the most well-known of which is probably PTSD. So just to introduce the geographical location of this presentation, we're going to go to St. Eustatius in the Dutch Caribbean. There are actually 6 Dutch Caribbean islands. 3 of them are, how do I do this? Down here by Venezuela, so this is Aruba, Curacao and Bonaire here. And then up here you've got St. Eustatius, St. Martin and Saba. And they're all pretty small islands. They're also quite diverse in terms of their climate and their history. And they were all really much too dry to develop large plantation economies like on Jamaica or Barbados. So they sort of diversified and went into different areas. And Curacao and St. Eustatius were big trading centres, while St. Martin and Bonaire produced salt. And Saba, for example, was an incredibly poor island throughout the colonial period. So they're quite diverse. And until 1986, they formed a group called the Lesser Antilles, which was not really a part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but had the same royal family. But then in 1986, Aruba became independent and was followed in 2010 by St. Martin and Curacao. I should say independently governing, they're not really independent. What this has meant is that St. Eustatius, Saba and Bonaire now have a much closer relationship with the Kingdom of the Netherlands than they had before. They're known as special municipalities, and this has led to a very neo-colonial relationship with the Dutch government. So to focus on St. Eustatius, it's a volcanic island. So it has 2 ancient craters, one here, which is older and so much more eroded, it just sort of resembles some little hills. And then here is a newer crater called the Keulen, which is quite deep actually, and I think Marie and Kathrine will be mentioning this in their presentation later. And then in the middle here, there's a flat agricultural plain where there were actually some sugar plantations, but the island made its money mostly from trade. And that took place here in Arnstad, where you can still see the ruins of hundreds of warehouses that are gently eroding into the sea. And yeah, today this island has a really small population. In fact, there are 4 times as many goats on the island as there are people. But in the 18th century, it had a really large population and was really a booming centre. And this also meant that the nature of slavery was a little bit different here in terms of it being primarily urban and the plantations having much smaller enslaved populations. And this has led some authors in the past to characterize slavery on this island as quote-unquote mild in comparison to slavery on big islands like Jamaica. But this is a really unhelpful way to look at slavery. For one thing, it really ignores the psychological aspect of enslavement, and it also ignores the fact that enslaved people living and working in close proximity to their enslavers may be in more danger of abuse. I think it's more helpful to acknowledge that slavery varied a lot according to the type of forced labour, the location, and various other aspects. But thinking of different types of slavery as better or worse is a little bit unhelpful, and it also diminishes the experiences of those not working on sugar plantations, and in the present, it is a way for people to dismiss the experiences of modern Caribbean people on small islands like St. Eustatius who are still experiencing structural racism as a result of slavery. So with this in mind, I'm just going to briefly share 2 theoretical approaches. So firstly, for my PhD, I chose a theoretical approach called Subaltern Studies, which is part of postcolonial theory, and it's deliberately interdisciplinary and it's reflexive, and it focuses on oppressed and marginalized individuals and groups, taking notes of silences and biases in dominant discourse. And I think reflexivity is important to mention here. So this examines the effects of your own identity on your data and your interpretations. And in qualitative research, which is what I do, that's really, really important. So the privileged identities that I have as a white middle class, cisgender, straight academic, those will affect the way that I see my data, but also I'm a woman with Caribbean heritage, and so I found in my PhD research that I had to finally balance those against each other. And to help me do this, I kept a reflexivity diary, which I still keep. And I think that's actually been one of my most helpful research tools. And I also used, as part of this approach, a definition of slavery that focused on the physical and psychological aspects of enslavement instead of on economic and administrative aspects, such as chattel, which I find other people studying slavery often focus on. And this also, I think, it gave a really important perspective on the data. It also allowed the incorporation of different theoretical approaches according to which data sets I was using. So the interdisciplinarity of this project really came in through the use of archaeological data, but also data from human remains and data from oral history. And that meant that I had to sort of weave these different theoretical approaches into each other. So the biocultural approach is an approach to the study of human remains that talks about how the way we live our lives impacts our skeleton, and contextualism is the approach that I used for the material culture from archaeology. The past and the present is more a way of looking at how the past affects us emotionally. It's from contemporary archaeology, but it kind of says that just because something is further away in time, does that really mean that we can distance ourselves from it emotionally? So yeah, that's a very quick run through my doctoral theoretical approach, but below the dotted line you can see this mention of envisioned features, and this is from Ernesto Bassi's book, and it puts territory, and this is something that we're using at NCMC to look at the relationships between islands in the Lesser Antilles. And I think it's very interesting to use this approach to position yourself inside the historical moment and think, okay, what were all the potential outcomes of any actions that you might take in that moment? Because as a historical actor, you might see several different possibilities as equally likely, whereas we are looking back into the past and we mainly see the thing that did happen and not the things that might have happened. And I think that is, for this topic of uncertainty, really, really important to think about, because it's what impacts your decision making. And I also think that this is another moment to mention the presentation by Marie and Kathrine, because uncertainty and all of these sort of myriad possible futures are the types of thing that will impact your decision when you're running away. So a brief discussion of the materials and methods. I've already mentioned that I use these three different data sets, so skeletons, artifacts, and oral histories. And today I'm mainly going to focus on the artifacts, but I'm just going to say a tiny bit on the slides about the oral histories and the skeletons. So analysing human remains can give you certain types of information that you can't really get anywhere else. But it also provides information that backs up other data sources. And in quantitative research, it's really important to have these different directions of data that can support each other. But actually, I find it most interesting when they don't support each other. Because when you're getting different information from different data sources, that allows you to ask the question, why? And so what I did was, I collected information from these three sources, and I put all of the data into this computer program called NVivo, and then I performed something called thematic analysis, which is used a lot in the social sciences. And in fact, I don't think that it had ever been used before on these specific data sets, so I was a little bit worried about whether or not it would work, but it worked. So that's good. And so you sort all of your data into different groups called themes, and then you can use those themes, for example, such as hard labour or psychological coping processes, to build a picture of what life was like for enslaved people. And you collect this data until you reach something called saturation, which is when new cases are no longer providing new data, and this comparison that you do between the different data sources is called triangulation. So that's just some quick social sciences vocabulary for you. And yeah, I had really chosen these three islands because they were islands that could provide all three of these data sources. I would have liked to include some of the other Dutch islands as well, but that wasn't possible at the time. I think perhaps it would be possible in the future, so maybe someone else can go back and do that later. Yeah, so here I'm going to just zoom in to uncertainty on city stages, specifically with the artifacts, because it's something that's always really interested me about this research, but something that I never had the opportunity to explore. So I think it's really nice for me to come in today and use Ernesto Bassi from NCMC to think about it a little bit better. So here I'm just going to briefly discuss some of the types of uncertainty that enslaved people on Southeast Asia might have experienced. It's not an exhaustive list, it's more just to help think about it. And if you have any other suggestions for things that could be added to this list, then please do let me know. So just to run down the left-hand side here, you can have both short and long-term uncertainties about things like food. So for example, can I eat tomorrow? And can I eat next year are two very different questions and will require different responses. it's the same with family. Like, can I rely on the fact that I will have my family with me tomorrow, and can I rely on the fact that I will have my family with me next year, are again two very different questions. And it's the same with health, which also ties into, for example, workplace accidents and punishments that might be experienced on the plantation, but also shelter, and that also is very closely related to the Caribbean environment. So is my house going to be destroyed by a hurricane? And location. So all of these factors would have been different depending on where the enslaved people were. And these all will feed into the type of investment that an enslaved person might make into things like resource acquisition and investment in projects such as boat building in order to escape, and also investment in communities and people. And this is something that Jennifer Morgan mentions in her book, Labouring Women, as well. So there was plenty of evidence for these uncertainties in my data sets. In osteology, or study of human skeletons, you can actually see when an individual has been experiencing chronic stress, for example, malnutrition, and that also there are skeletal changes that can happen due to psychological stress. So these sort of all interlink with each other. And there was also evidence for coping mechanisms that enslaved people might have used to cope with uncertainty in the oral historical data set. So what I actually did for that was I conducted interviews on each of the islands that I studied on, and then I would transcribe the interviews, do a basic thematic analysis of what I thought was going on inside these data sets, and then send that analysis back to the interviewees. So what happened was that I was having a dialogue with the stakeholders about the interpretations that I made from their testimonies, and that meant that what I ended up with, this sort of description of what lifeways were like for enslaved people, was really co-created with the people who I interviewed. Yeah, so these things that I observed occurred on a local scale, but also on a more inter-island scale. And one important source to reference here, I think, is there's a 2008 article in the Journal of Caribbean Archaeology by Allman et al., entitled Ceramic Production and Exchange Amongst Enslaved Africans on St. Kitts in the West Indies. And this is an article that uses petrographic analysis to compare pottery sheds from St. Kitts to those from other nearby islands like St. Eustatius. So petrographic analysis is when you take a thin section out of a piece of pottery, you look at it under the microscope, and you see from its sort of basic structure where it was probably made. There are lots of things that can vary in the soil in a particular place, but also in terms of the things that you add to it to temper the pottery as well. So what Allman et al. Did was they looked at this and they suggest that there may have been a network of pottery exchange between enslaved people on St. Kitts and Montserrat or St. Eustatius. And more research needs to be done in this area, but we already know from other sources that enslaved people were also trading other items such as fish between islands. So one thing I think that is interesting to note here is that if you compare a system that a community uses in order to survive to an ecological system, a more complex ecological system is more robust than a simple one. And this is where the diversification issue comes in. And that's what I'm just going to briefly look at using archaeological evidence on the next slide. So enslaved people on St. Eustatius did grow their own food, for example, yams and beans, but they also obtained resources in a variety of other ways, such as fishing, foraging, barter, and engagement with the monetary economy. And there's also a culture of sharing visible in the enslaved community, which you can see in communal foodways. So the types of pottery that you find in an enslaved village indicate that food was made in a big pot and then shared around. But also other evidence. So on the bottom here, you can see some fragments of bone that come from a pig skull. So these are pig teeth. And an interesting fact, pig teeth are very, very, very similar to human teeth. And often when you find them in archaeology, they get mistaken for human teeth, but these are definitely pig ones. And some fragments of pig skull as well. And these were found, again, in an enslaved village on St. Eustatius. And this really tied in with what I had been hearing from interviewees about these communal foodways. So people were saying to me, you know, enslaved people, they couldn't afford the cuts of meat that maybe the enslavers were eating, but they could get hold of the heads and the feet. And so those would go into the stew pot, and that is exactly what we see in archaeology. So there's lots of evidence for the heads and feet being used in the enslaved village. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the top photograph is an early 18th century drinking glass, which was also found in an enslaved village in St. Eustatius. And it's not the only one. There's another one, pretty complete, like this one is, from the same village, and then also just fragments of glass that probably come from similar vessels as well. Then there's a question of how did enslaved people acquire such a luxury item? And this is something that other archaeologists in the past have discussed, and they have cited, engagement with the monetary economy because of this sort of booming trade centre that St. Eustatius was, and have kind of used this to say that maybe slavery on St. Eustatius was more quote-unquote violent, as I mentioned at the beginning. But I think if you use the concept of uncertainty to look at that, we know that not only did St. Eustatius experience some periods during which the economy was definitely not booming, but also when hard times come, enslaved people are likely to be the ones who experience those hard times first. And so then what you get is perhaps access to these luxury goods, but uncertain access. And if you have nice plates or a nice drinking glass, that doesn't take away the fact that you might lose your family tomorrow. So I think this is one of the ways where archaeology can, if it's not careful, fall down, because just looking at this fancy drinking glass is not the whole story. And other ways that people may have actually obtains items like this would be things like stealing or gift giving, or perhaps even hand-me-downs from the big house on the plantation. So there are lots of different ways that you could interpret that drinking glass. So I'm concluding with a brief list of some themes that stand out for me in these data sets when we think about uncertainty, and diversification is a really important one. But also opportunism, the importance of local and inter-island networks. So for example, that network of ceramic exchange that may have helped support enslaved people on different islands. And resistance to enslavement, for example, by planning escapes. And creativity in a new environment as well. And I think uncertainty is therefore a really useful lens through which to view decision-making by enslaved people in St. Eustatius. I should say that when I first embarked on my PhD research, I wasn't sure whether this would work, but it did. And I think it still provided me with things to think about, because this theme of uncertainty was not something that I really addressed during my PhD. And also, as I mentioned before, the fact that the data sets broadly agree with each other is great, and it allows you to say that you have triangulated everything, but then when you get these disjunctures between the different data sets, that's also very interesting, and particularly when you encounter these silences that Spivak also mentions in the literature on Subaltern Studies. And silence actually, I think, in the data sets that I looked at, was one of the things that people might use to cope. I'm going to switch quickly, because I think I have time, give us a quick example from Curacao, so one of the other islands that I studied on. In Curacao, there's a very, very famous leader of a revolt called Keulen, and we know from historical sources which plantation he lived on. I interviewed people from that plantation who'd grown up there their whole lives, and they said, oh, we didn't hear anything about Keulen as children. So despite the fact that he's a national hero, and there are all these historical documents, and there's even been a film made about him recently, it's bad, don't watch it. Despite the fact that he's so important for Curacao identity, in the village where he lived, there was no oral history about him. And that's, I think, a very ringing and profound silence. So if you want to read more about this, I've actually published a book. It's pronounced Slaveries. I'm sorry, I should have called it something else. And I actually brought a couple of copies of it with me if anyone really, really wants one. But yeah, Masha, thank you. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
So we are starting with a new set of In the Same Sea all about boats and living. We have first presentation by Rasmus Christensen and Gunvor Simonsen, so on small boat infrastructure and fugitive collectives in the Lesser Antilles.
Yes. So we are presenting together, and I think it's our first time presenting together, so you will have to excuse us if we are not doing it as smoothly as we could. It's a project that Rasmus and I have worked on together since this In the Seas project began. Now Rasmus has been so fortunate as to become also a PhD student, and he's changing focus a little bit, but we carry on with this project nevertheless. So let me see if I can make it. So in our presentation today, we will focus on the particular form of marronage that the infrastructure of small craft supported in the Lesser Antilles. We hope to contribute to an understanding of how enslaved in the Lesser Antilles developed strategies of escape that were shaped by their particular archipelagic environment. Ultimately, but perhaps not today, we hope to demonstrate the existence of two parallel and obviously intertwined forms of maritime marronage in the Lesser Antilles. These parallel forms of marronage arose because of the parallel infrastructures that enabled mobility in the region. In other words, the large ocean-going vessels established fugitive opportunities that were best seized by single men who could find hire as sailors in the Atlantic fleet. In contrast, the smaller boats catered to other groups: men, women, children, young, old, rural, and urban. Indeed, small craft made rural sugar estates part of a fugitive geography that spanned the Lesser Antilles and afforded the collective organization of escape. We begin today by sketching the archipelagic infrastructure of the Lesser Antilles. Then we say something about the presence and the number of small boats in the Lesser Antilles. And finally, we look at what kind of fugitive practices small craft infrastructure afforded.
So the archipelago of the Lesser Antilles is characterized by a large number of islands, some 25 being what you might call main islands, and significantly more if you include smaller islands in case, all situated in very close proximity to each other. Thus, if the weather conditions are right, you can sail from one island to the next, all the way from Grenada to the US Virgin Islands and even further on to Cuba, without losing sight of land, except maybe for a few places. The persistent winds and currents allow for an easier travel from the southeast to northwest, somewhat splitting the archipelago in two between Dominica and Martinique. The northern part named the Leeward Islands, and the southern named the Windward Islands. It was of course possible to travel against the wind and currents, but it took a lot more time and effort to do so. Nonetheless, with boats powered by oars rather than sails, this was a distinct possibility. Another characteristic of the small islands were the relatively long stretches of flat coastlines, making the islands easily accessible with small boats that could be hauled onto the shore, while larger ships would have to lie at anchor further out on roadsteads or near ports. The long coastlines also made it possible to get easy access to local resources. So while more and more land on the larger islands gradually became dedicated to growing export crops, the sea, as well as the nearby small islands in Cayes, could offer plenty of local resources. So due to the physical and meteorological nature of the Lesser Antilles, small boats were well suited to connect the different islands and as we will show, an important part of the archipelagic infrastructure.
The languages of or spoken in the Caribbean, English, Spanish, French, Dutch, Danish, and Swedish, the many Creoles, and probably also many African languages, have a wealth of words and expressions that characterize the curving and rugged coastlines of the archipelago. The bays and the outbays, the pans, the ponds, lagoons, and basins that mark the meeting between land and sea. Island shores connected the sea and the estates, the sea, the bush, and the forest. And therefore, they also connected many enslaved people to the world outside their estates. The rock shorelines meant that small craft had advantages compared to the larger ocean-going vessels that carried enslaved captives and bulk goods across long distances from continent to continent. Small craft could anchor close to beaches, could be hauled on them, it could reach shallow bays, and at times it could be hidden under the rich foliage of seaside vegetation. Mangrove, sea grapes, and other saline plants could grow in salty, sandy soil and provided good cover for those smugglers or slaves who wanted to move in secret. Together, the small boats and the relatively long and overgrown coastlines of the Lesser Antilles provided enslaved people with the cover needed to plan and execute flights.
But while the close proximity of the islands, as well as their hilly and mountainous appearance, allowed for easy navigation between them by people in small boats, it also meant that they were very exposed and visible from any lookouts. This drawing, showing the silhouettes of some of the Lesser Antillean islands, it is clear that while islands topography made it easier for ship captains to navigate towards a specific island, it also allows us to imagine all the points from which the boats could be seen, and therefore how difficult it could be to avoid the gaze of possible pursuers when out on the open sea. Thus, if one wanted to get away without being seen, one would have to rely on the cover provided by the darkness of the night.
During the 18th century, many Lesser Antillean islands would be covered by cotton and cane fields, with little land reserved for the production of food and other daily necessities. The societies of the Lesser Antilles were fragile, often with a population that many-fold exceeded the resources that each island could provide. In this sense, the islands were unsustainable places, with a continuous need for food to sustain both the enslaved population, but also, in times of crisis, free people of color and whites of all rank. The sea and its resources, fish, turtle, sand, stone, salt, information, trade, and freedom, was also always crucial for the continued reproduction of these slave societies. And this was also why small boats were crucial for island existence. The small boats, the canoes, prams, couples, and there's so many words for small boats that I could go on and on, that could navigate on shallow water in rough terrain and between islands in close proximity, gave islanders access to these marine resources. The need for small craft stands out, for instance, in the reaction to the hurricane that rampaged through the Lesser Antilles in August 1772. It was one of the most violent hurricanes in 18th century Caribbean history. It destroyed and killed where it touched ground. Houses were leveled to the ground, ships were thrown ashore, provision fields were ruined by the strong winds. In the Danish Caribbean newspaper, the Royal Danish American Gazette, the effects of the hurricane were described like this. It's also up there, I quote, "The most dreadful hurricane known here in the memory of man. All our shipping were drove on shore, many of the buildings shattered to pieces." And while news arrived to the Danish islands about the utter destruction of nearby islands, St. Eustatius, St. Kitts, and Antigua, the Danish Governor General Ulrik Wilhelm von Hofstraff, a terrible name, he cannot help it, issued a local ordinance in which everyone, and it's up here, in particular those who are at the seashore, are advised to send out canoes and to fish as much as possible. So the canoes and other small craft could apparently, or at least metaphorically, break the wind. The size of the larger ships provided, so to speak, a grip for the powerful hurricane, and their weight when they hit ground after being moved by the wind ensured their own destruction. In contrast, the boats, lighter and of smaller dimensions, suffered less damage. It was, according to Danish authorities, these boats, the canoes, that had to help islanders refill hungry stomachs. The boats were crucial elements in the first steps towards re-establishing social order after the hurricane. So islanders could not do without small craft. It is in this sense that the small craft can be understood as a universal in the Lesser Antilles. The universal is and was, as the post-colonial sociologist Gominda Bramba has argued, something that we cannot not want. Islanders, all islanders, could not want their small craft. It was key to their world.
Canoes and small boats were indeed crucial for the archipelagic colonies, but they were also damaging, at least in the view of the colonial elites. The friction between the usefulness and the problematic aspects of the canoe and the small boats is very accurately described in a local ordinance from 1737 by the governor of the Danish West Indies, Frederik Moe. I quote, "I admit that fishing is a large help for poor people, in particular when vivre is scarce. This is the reason canoes cannot easily completely done away with. Yet one sees the danger, and that the country in general has suffered greatly because of the running away of so many slaves. Indeed, one rich man can be ruined in one night because of the negligence shown by another towards his canoe." The quote reveals that the canoes were indeed crucial for the small island colonies. In fact, they were vital, while at the same time capable of shaking the very foundation of which these societies were built, the institution of racial slavery. The canoes posed a threat to the system of slavery by offering enslaved people the opportunity to challenge the slave owners' need to control their mobility and activities. Additionally, canoes also allowed enslaved people to engage with the larger archipelagic space. To try to cope with the problems that canoes posed, the colonial governments across the Lesser Antilles tried to establish a legal framework that could control the mobility of the small boats by issuing loads of ordinances, acts, and placards. Many of these are quite similar in wording and content across the colonies of the various empires, suggesting that the colonial legislators were inspired by one another. From among these, we have picked a few, a Danish, a British, and a Dutch, to give you an impression of the nature of these colonial laws. Here follows some extracts, and I quote the first one. Announcement of on what conditions canoes can be kept. Firstly, fishing canoes on the plantations, being the length of 10 to 20 English feet long, may not be able to carry more than 3 men. And thirdly, there must not be more than 1 Negro in the canoe under the penalty of 10 piastres. But despite the persistent issuing of legislation, the colonial governments could not govern the canoes and small boats. This was partly because of their inherent qualities, being relatively small and light and therefore easy to navigate and hide, partly because of insufficient manpower to enforce the laws, and partly because of the large number of these small vessels. Enslaved people, especially in smaller groups consisting of men, women, children, and elderly people, made their escape using these small vessels.
Small craft, such as the bumboats, couples, and dugouts, and as we'll show here in Kathrine's and Maria's presentation, even water containers, were scattered everywhere along the shores of the islands of the Lesser Antilles. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these many boats were often referred to by the term canoe. And now you will have to excuse my bad pronunciation of Dutch and French, okay? Anyway, the Danish and Dutch canoe, the English canoe, the French canoe, and their parallels, the Spanish, French, English, piragua, pirogue, periauger, petitauger, are mentioned in travel narratives, in local degrees, in government registers, in official correspondence, and island newspapers. The many boat types subsumed under the canoe heading was a feature of most Lesser Antillean islands. Lists of small craft contained in so-called canoe ledgers from the Danish West Indies evidence that the term canoe was used to capture the use of small open boats rather than their specific type. In the Dutch islands, colonial authorities repeatedly issued decrees concerning small craft, using a plethora of terms to describe them and their use, such as the canoes, sail, pleasure, and fishing boats that were regulated in St. Martin in 1787. This was also true for the British Islands, whose officials wrote of boats, canoes, piragos in Antigua in 1669, and of fishing and other boats, canoes, shallops, sloops, and backlogs in Nevis in 1718. Boat nomenclature only appears to have grown during the 18th century, reflecting the many uses of small craft in Antillean waters. And we can come even closer to this small craft infrastructure. The so-called canoe protocoller, or canoe ledgers, of the Danish islands St. Thomas and St. John contain no less than 2,149 smaller craft recorded from 1771 to 1825. The majority of these boats were 14 to 18 feet long and 1.5 to 3.5 feet wide. They were capable of holding some 4 to 5 persons. While recording practice varied from year to year, the ledgers nevertheless indicate the density or coverage of small craft in the Lesser Antilles. In the year 1802, in which registration, for various reasons, was unusually comprehensive, there were around 142 boats in these islands and approximately 1,100 free adults. In other words, there was more or less one canoe for every 8 free adults in the islands. There's no reason to assume that numbers of small open boats were significantly lower on other islands in the Lesser Antilles. The ownership profile of Lesser Antillean small craft included rich and poor, whites and people of color, estate owners and town dwellers. In 1754, for instance, the governor and council of Dutch, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao addressed themselves, and I quote, to fishers, Negroes, and mulattoes, whether free or slave, making clear that both groups were fishing in the waters surrounding the islands. In the Danish islands, planters, colonial officers, and a significant number of free people of color were also among the boat owners. Indeed, 10% of Danish boats were owned by this latter group. And the importance of small craft to free people of color also marked the British Islands. In 1837, one observer of Antigua stated that, and I quote, "Here, as elsewhere, the black and colored population find employment in great numbers in fishing and pilot boats," end of quote.
So in the literature of the so-called Maritime Marronage, that is escape across the sea, there has been a tendency to focus on port towns as the most obvious place to depart from, as it offered the escapee the possibility of blending in with the populous and chaotic environment of those towns. Following this assumption, The focus has been on larger ships as the typical means to get away by hiding in the ship hold or passing as deckhand. Here are a few examples spanning the last 40 years, and I quote them first. For slaves in small islands, towns offer the advantages of relative anonymity, a prospect of work on the wharves, in warehouses, and aboard coastal or other vessels. The chance of using the town as a staging post in what might become a steppe migration to freedom. While these presentations of maritime marronage are true for many cases, we suggest that it is only part of the picture. Admittedly, these authors also note some cases with enslaved people running away in small boats, but the idea that different contexts offer different possibilities for different people is yet to be explored in depth. Therefore, while port towns offer possibilities for the single main runaway or maybe larger groups that could steal a large boat or small ship, smaller groups, such as families, would have to look for different options to get away, and that is using canoes and small boats departing from areas outside of the towns. Thus, by paying extra attention to the contexts and options of those who ran away, we will get closer to an awareness and understanding of what you might call a parallel fugitive geography. So here are some examples of cases with small groups using small boats to get away, and I quote the first. I have a young Negro man named Yankee who ran away from me without occasion the 27th June in a canoe with two of Mr. Isaac Summons, a young Negro man named B, and an elderly one named Yankee. These examples show that enslaved people ran away in smaller groups that could consist of both men, women, children, and elderly people using small boats. The example from Guadeloupe also suggests that some groups departed from coastal areas far from port towns, and allows us to begin to rethink the dichotomy between the port town as a place of opportunities and possibly freedom, as opposed to the closed and restricted plantation environment. Different contexts simply offer different possibilities for different people, and the enslaved people knew how to navigate them within them and to make use of them. So, to take a more quantitative approach to the phenomenon of marronage in general and maritime marronage in particular, we are in the process of creating a database in which the team of the In the Same Sea register runaway notices and individuals from newspapers from all over the Lesser Antilles, and that is from both British, Danish, Dutch, French, and Swedish colonies. The entries cover the period from 1767 to 1863, when the Dutch, as the last of these imperial powers, abolished slavery. At the moment, we have entered 1,014 cases concerning 1,702 individuals. Although the database is still not finished, we have made some preliminary calculations. So, among the total number of individuals, 72% are not maritime, 14% are what we call assumed maritime maroons, and 14% are maritime maroons. Those we call assumed are those cases in which it's not stated if the runaway actually left the island, but where the subscriber indicates that it is a possibility that the runaway did indeed left the island by issuing warnings to captains and owners of vessels. Of the maritime runaways, 46% ran away alone, while the rest, 54%, ran away as part of a group. If we compare that ratio of single versus group maritime fugitives to that of those who presumably ran away on their islands of bondage, we see a significant difference. For the landlocked runaways, 23% ran away as part of a group, while 77% ran away alone. Thus, our calculations show that a significant characteristic of maritime marronage was that it was often carried out in groups compared to marronage on land, which tended to be done individually. Though obviously not conclusive, the numbers still support the case that we need to turn our attention to the infrastructure provided by small boats.
The collective efforts afforded by small craft also stands out when a group of 10, perhaps 11 enslaved men and women nurtured an escape plan in June 1748 on the Danish island St. Croix. They attempted, but ultimately failed to Puerto Rico. I've indicated on this map where we are on St. Croix, and a little information about St. Croix in this particular period. They presumably hoped to enjoy freedom, the freedom they could gain in Puerto Rico due to the sanctuary policies of the Spanish crown. The plan, as it can be surmised from the transcripts of the interrogations produced in the island court, entailed that the fugitive walked one Saturday evening toward two shoreline estates east of the town of Christensen in the island's company quarter. Here they would use a boat taken or stolen from the warehouse of Christensen's harbor front and hidden in a cane field. However, as they arrived at their point of departure, they were captured, and subsequently they were prosecuted, which is why we can speak about them today. 8 enslaved people were sentenced to dismemberment and banishment. Owners were compensated for their so-called loss. And here is an attempt to map the various social relationships and ties that connected this group of enslaved people. The actual escape involved 3, perhaps 4 enslaved couples: Primus and his wives Flora and Abba, Toby and Molly, and Stephanie, his wife Rosie, and their child. In addition, the flight plan included Baron and Diana, whose relationship was not clarified during legal proceedings. These 3, perhaps 4, intimate relationships formed the social node of the plan. In Christensen's Byting, the court of first instance in the jurisdiction of Christensen St. Croix, defendant upon defendant relayed that they had shared information with their spouses about the boat and about the where and the when of the departure for Puerto Rico. Together, their legal testimonies reveal a complex web of connections that can be difficult to follow. Nevertheless, the testimonies underscore that ties of family, kin, and friendship were mobilized to effect escape. The 3 men, Primus, Toby, and Stephanie, appear to have orchestrated the plan. In court, Flora, for instance, stated that, I quote, "a Negro man came to speak with her husband Primus one Saturday on the estate of the Downings. Following their private conversation, Primus had ordered Flora to go to the line that is the border between the two shoreline estates, one belonging to a Mr. Boyles, another to the Evans family. And next in the evening, Primus had gone to Abba, also his wife, and he had ordered her to go first to Downing's estate and then to Evans' estate. On her way, Abba had met up with Flora and Molly, the wife of Toby." Now it's getting so complicated that even I cannot follow this introduction. But the main point is here that step by step, a network of fugitives were tied together by familial bonds emerged. And on this extract of the map, I've indicated where they wanted to escape from. It's the red square, and then where they came from, which is all the black squares. During interrogations, nobody spoke to the question of why Evans and Boyle's estates had been chosen by the fugitive families as their point of departure. None of them lived there. Yet these estates may have had several advantages. On the estates, land joined the sea, and crossroads joined the river, forming an in-between scape, neither land nor water-based. placed outside Christensen in an area dominated by sugar agriculture. Boyle's estate had two roads crossing one another. A small river or a large stream crossed through the estate's cane fields on its way towards the sea. Shoreline estates like that of Boyle's and Evans were privileged within the larger Atlantic trade and production system. Access to the sea lowered transport cost, enhancing the profits of sugar cultivation. Freshwater streams and rivers offset some of the dangers of living in drought-ridden islands. Yet this productive landscape was also a place of escape. After all, they hide the boat in the cane field. The roads that crossed through Boyle's estate allowed the fugitive relatively easy access to the sea, and from that point they planned to escape together in a small boat.
So to quickly summarize our presentation, both rural estates and urban ports were fugitive places, and canoes and small boats offered different opportunities for different people within the island world. They allowed for the collective organization of escapes by both men, women, and children and elderly.
So the last but not the least presentation by Kathrine Larsen and Marie Keulen on planning collective maritime Marronage in the Dutch and Danish Lesser Antilles.
Yes, thank you, Cécile, and thank you for the Wilberforce Institute for having us. Yes.
You want to?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. On an early Monday morning in April 1833, two enslaved women, both by the name of Mary, were waiting along with 9 other people for a boat to pick them up from one of the outer bays of the Dutch island of St. Eustatius. The day before, the women had arranged to meet a young white sailor named William Burroughs on the eastern point of the island. The sailor would bring Mary and Mary to the nearby British island of St. Christopher, where they hoped to gain their freedom. When Burroughs and his 2 companions arrived at the agreed location, 9 other enslaved people seemed to have seized this opportunity of maritime escape and joined the 2 women. Perhaps the group of people who had gathered on the eastern shore were relatives and were fleeing together with their loved ones. Perhaps they were from the same owner, working on the same estate and escaping the same oppressive regime of slavery. However, the severe weather conditions of the day prevented the planned maritime escape from succeeding. Before the group of runaways could board Burroughs' boat, it capsized in the pounding sea. The story of the 2 Marys and the group of people joining them is not unique. Enslaved people from all parts of the Lesser Antilles attempted to run away from the islands they inhabited. They hoped to gain freedom, escape the hardships of living in slavery, or reunite with relatives and loved ones. By facing the dangers of the sea and boarding a vessel, boat, or canoe, runaway slaves attempted to cross imperial borders and reach foreign soil. While some of these maritime escapes, like the 2 Marys, were unsuccessful, others succeeded in reaching their destination. The existence of the maritime Marronage in the Lesser Antilles and in the Caribbean in general is widely known among historians. Yet little has been written about how enslaved people actually planned their escapes. How did maritime Marronage take place, and what logistics were involved in the planning, preparing, and execution of these collective attempts to escape slavery by crossing the sea? By analyzing Dutch and Danish colonial records of both the successful and the unsuccessful attempts of escape, we aim to get a closer view of the people who fled and ask questions as to why they might have fled and how they organized their flights. We focus on the Maritime's escapes from the Dutch island of St. Eustatius and the Danish island of St. John, sorry. And the people who fled to the neighboring British islands of St. Christopher and Tortola. Here Tortola comes into the picture. In the early to mid-19th century. And in our analysis of these cases, we will demonstrate that maritime fugitive practices were complicated operations in which enslaved people utilized both their knowledge, their skills, and also their social networks to plan and execute flight attempts. And you have seen this map before, but we're going to show it again. The local authorities of the Dutch and Danish Leeward Islands regularly wrote in the governor's journals and in letters to foreign authorities about the groups of enslaved people who had attempted or succeeded in escaping from their islands. By far, most of these maritime runaways fled to the neighboring British islands of St. Christopher, Anguilla, and Tortola. And the British islands were so nearby that they were within clear sight of the Dutch and Danish Leeward Islands. And here you can see just exactly how close they actually are. And this proximity and visual presence of other islands is what we believe a fundamental characteristic of the Lesser Antilles, and was an important impetus for maritime marronage. The clear outlines of foreign land on the other side of the sea, outlines of hills, coast, and houses must have encouraged hopes of freedom. In addition, abolitionist developments in the British Empire in the early to mid-19th century offered new opportunities for runaways to obtain what we call a certain degree of freedom once they set foot on British soil. Due to the introduction of the British Slave Trade Act in 1825, was very important for this, because this law severely restricted the extradition of runaways by essentially equating it with slave trade. Thus, inter-imperial extradition became increasingly difficult in the years following 1825. And as a result, Dutch and Danish administrators' attempts to prevent enslaved people from escaping or to recapture those who succeeded in doing so became further complicated.
Thank you. Yes, active maritime marronage started well before the moment enslaved people boarded a boat, canoe, or vessel. Enslaved people's attempted escape were complicated operations that required substantial planning. And the exceptionally rich Danish and Dutch colonial records show us that enslaved men and women, such as the two Marys in the beginning of this presentation, actively planned their escape and that they used their knowledge, skills, and networks to do so. And I will discuss several cases that particularly highlight the use of knowledge and skills. So, knowledge of the island's environment, of the legal and administrative frameworks, law enforcement, and possible means of transport were vital to get away safely and unseen. And once in the open sea, navigation skills and being able to read the weather were also essential to actually reach the foreign shores. Throughout the early to mid-19th century, the Dutch colonial authorities of St. Eustatius and the Danish authorities of St. John were confronted with various collective runaway cases. And despite the continuous struggles of the authorities to put an end to these fugitive practices through the promulgation of various ordinances, enslaved people continued to escape. With these ordinances, authorities regulated the use of small vessels, attempting to keep slaves from stealing the boats and using them to escape. The strategies used by enslaved people were not limited to stealing boats. In 1834, more than 20 people were involved in the plan of escaping the Dutch island St. Eustatius with self-made canoes crafted from 3 stumps. The 2 canoes, about 5 and 3.5 meters long, were crafted and hidden in the inactive volcano that Felicia already showed in her presentation. And according to the commander of the island, it was only by mere coincidence that the plot has been discovered. As this case shows, despite these attempts by authorities to restrict access to boats, enslaved people still found ways off the islands using their knowledge, skills and networks. The more than 20 people who were already at the right side. The more than 20 people involved in the making and hiding of the canoes were from different estates and owners. The scattered archival traces that have been preserved tell us that the main planner of the escape was an enslaved man called Benjamin Burnham. And it is interesting because 2 years before this case, he actually fled from St. Christopher to St. Eustatius, and now he was trying to go back with a group of other enslaved people. Burnham was interrogated in the investigation of the case, as well as 5 other people, Tom Phipps, Henry, Periana, and Liddy. And unfortunately, only the interrogations of Tom Phipps has been preserved. And Tom Phipps explained that while he ran away from his owner and he was hiding in the volcano, and while he was hiding, he stumbled across Burnham, who was there working on the canoes. And Burnham told Phipps, I quote, that he was going to St. Christopher and asked him to help about a boat that was there in the volcano. Phipps, who was also from St. Christopher, and who perhaps had waited for an opportunity like this, joined Burnham's plan and assisted him in finishing the boat. Well, given that making a dugout canoe is very laborious and time-consuming, it would have taken hundreds of hours to make a dugout canoe, Burnham and his co-conspirators must have been planning his escape for a long time. They would have needed tools and knowledge to turn a tree stump into a boat which they could cross the 15 kilometers of sea separating St. Eustatius and St. Christopher. And once finished, they would also need to carry their canoes from the volcano to the shore where they could depart without being noticed by the authorities. The volcano was an ideal hiding spot, but it was not very accessible, and that also came with its own problems because well, it required time to go to the volcano and back, which would have made it difficult to move easily and quickly between the hideout place and an estate. Yet staying at the volcano was also challenging because it was difficult to provide yourself with food and water. So these circumstances point out that the group of enslaved people who were involved in the plan would have had to establish long-term cooperation and also communication across states to coordinate their efforts. While Burnham and Phipps used their knowledge to craft dugout canoes, other enslaved people used existing island and plantation infrastructure. And an example of this can be found in March 1845, when a group of 11 enslaved people escaped the Danish islands St. John. They successfully fled to Tortola. And here the runaways escaped in an unusual vessel. Gunvor already mentioned it. They escaped in a so-called water receiver. That was a large container commonly used as a cistern to collect rainwater. And the enslaved people, we know from the interrogations of the case, we clearly know that they used their experiences and skills they had gained while working on the plantations to plan and execute their escape. The water receiver was located right outside the plantation manager's window on a 4 meters tall scaffolding above the plantation's well. The investigators of the runaway case noted that, I quote, significant strength must have been used to remove it without making noise, especially as it was placed right outside manager Curry's bedroom's window. On the night of the escape, the group of runaways quietly lowered the water receiver from the scaffolding while the manager was sound asleep. This indicates that they must have knowledge, routine, and training in demounting the water receiver, making it possible for them to minimize the noise of the process. And as the water receiver also could have been full of water at that moment, they would have needed to empty it or waited for the perfect moment when the water receiver would have been empty. how the runaways had decided on using this special vessel, or using the water receiver as a vessel, was also disclosed in the police investigations. Interrogations revealed that the water receiver had actually also been used as a vessel for maritime activities on the plantation, often for collecting limestone from the bay. William Toney, an enslaved man from a neighboring plantation, testified that he had spoken with one of the main organizers a few months prior, suggesting that the planning of the escape had already been underway for a couple of months. And during this conversation, the main organizer, Johannes Paulus, he had revealed that the weight of the people he was planning to bring on board was in no way close to the weight that he had seen the water receiver carry before, when carrying the limestone from the bay. And as the 11 people managed to escape to Tortola, also without capsizing at sea, Johannes Paulus' knowledge of the water receiver proved to be essential for the success of the flight.
Now, the interconnected nature of the Lesser Antilles was a vital part of planning collective Marronage. And as we've all in the panel been talking about, this close proximity of the islands both made it possible to see the outlines of foreign islands. This is a photo from St. John, and in the background you can see Tortola. So when it's clear weather, you can definitely see across the shore. But the proximity made people able to see outlines of foreign islands and imagine possibilities of escapes, but it also facilitated inter-island networks that enslaved men and women could utilize when planning their flight. The cases I will be discussing in the following shows that these networks were in part shaped by the movement of enslaved people between plantations and colonies. Now, the British Slave Trade Act of 1825 had declared the movement of enslaved people from British islands to foreign colonies illegal, but there still existed a few exceptions to these regulations. Domestic slaves escorted by their owners, as well as fishermen and sailors, were still able to move somewhat freely between the colonies. And in the years following the Slave Trade Act, an English woman by the name of Elizabeth Trefoil, who owned plantations on both Tortola and St. John, had taken advantage of this, let's call it loophole, and illegally moved enslaved people from her Tortola plantation Sea Cow Bay to her estates on St. John. According to the customs officials on Tortola, and also several of the enslaved people that had been relocated, Trefoil had on numerous occasions illegally moved enslaved workers between the two islands, and she had done so by citing them as being domestic slaves and sailors when she was questioned by the customs officials on Tortola. In reality, they were put to field work on Trefoil's plantations on St. John. So she had thus managed to circumvent these regulations in the Slave Trade Act and relocate several enslaved workers from her British to her Danish plantations. These violations of the Slave Trade Act do not seem to have had any severe consequences for Trefoil herself. Shortly before her death in November 1831, she petitioned to have her remaining enslaved workers moved from Tortola to Trinidad, where they would then be sold off. And we don't know how often planters circumvented these regulations of the Slave Trade Act, but we do know that they often held properties across islands and empires in the Lesser Antilles. A similar case also occurred a few years earlier when Abraham C. Hill had illegally moved enslaved workers between his estates on Tortola and St. John. So perhaps it wasn't that out of the ordinary. While this movement of enslaved people between Tortola and St. John tore apart families and friends, it also created new social networks and ties between the enslaved workers on both islands. These networks played an important part in the planning and execution of a series of escapes that would soon follow. In August 1831, a group of 7 enslaved people, 3 men, 2 women, and 2 children, stole a boat from a nearby plantation, and fled St. John to Tortola. They all came from the same plantation, which was owned by Elizabeth Trefoil on St. John, and at least one of them was an enslaved worker that she had transferred from Tortola. Over the next 4 months, several of Trefoil's enslaved workers escaped St. John and were later seen on the Sea Cow Bay plantation on Tortola, suggesting that they fled to be reunited with friends and family. This was further supported by the chief of police on St. John. According to him, there was, and I quote, "hardly any doubt that boats from Tortola at night arrived by the outer bays of St. John to abduct said island slaves, and that these escapes were part of a series of pre-agreed complots, where runaways would return to help friends and family escape." Now, while some could perhaps rely on loved ones for help, other runaways had to seek assistance from a group of free Afro-Caribbeans with access to boats. In the middle of January 1832, 3 enslaved people named Lucas, Sally, and Jemmy found themselves hiding in some bushes near a bay in St. John. With them, they had a few bags of clothes and linens, along with a box and a chest with belongings that they had carried to the bushes and hidden. Here they were waiting to be picked up by a boat that would take them to Tortola, where they would reunite with friends and family, some of which were also runaways from St. John. A while later, 2 free Afro-Caribbean men, Johannes Petersen and Jules Heidegger, of which the latter appeared to be very drunk, arrived in a boat and took Lucas, Sally, and Jemmy away. Once they set foot on Tortola, the 3 runaways paid Johannes Petersen $6 for the crossing and then parted ways. Lucas, Sally, and Jemmy were later seen on the grounds of the Sea Cow Bay plantation. Johannes Petersen and Jules Heidegger were arrested in the following days. This particular flight illuminates the complex and diverse network surrounding maritime marronage. It suggests that in some cases there must have been a business-like infrastructure embedded in the flight. Perhaps some free Afro-Caribbean people or sailors with access to boats made a profitable business out of assisting enslaved people in their flights. That the before-mentioned George Heidegger appeared drunk while he was on the boat suggests that he was either scared or nervous about getting caught, or perhaps on the contrary, that he did not view it as a risky operation and had done it multiple times. The arrangement between the 3 runaways and the 3 Afro-Caribbean men does not appear to have been out of the ordinary. In fact, we know of other similar agreements on the Danish islands, as well as on other islands, the Lesser Antilles, that were similar. In 1827, Johannes Simonsen sailed a group of slaves from St. Thomas to Tortola and received the so-called passage money for the crossing. Or, for example, in 1833, when the 2 Marys mentioned in the beginning of this presentation made an agreement with the young white sailor Burroughs. Burroughs arrived on St. Eustatius on a Saturday, having traveled there from St. Christopher to trade. It is on this day or the next that Mary and Mary must have noticed his presence in the harbor of the island. On Sunday evening, when the sun had already set and they were less vulnerable for watching eyes, they approached Burroughs and made their deal. Burroughs does not appear to have had any personal connection to the people involved in the escape. So it was likely a business agreement between the 2 enslaved women and Burroughs, the latter obtaining a financial gain. The fact that enslaved people could plan their escape by having contact with and making agreements with free sailors was an alarming and frightening observation for the slave owners and the local authorities. On St. Eustatius, the case of the 2 Marys led to extensive legal proceedings against the free white sailors, as the colonial authorities hoped to set an example by sentencing them to severe corporal punishment for their role in facilitating slaves' escape.
That brings me to the conclusion of the presentation. As these flight attempts that we have discussed from St. Eustatius and St. John have shown, collective maritime marronage in the Lesser Antilles was a complicated process that required meticulous planning. Specific skills of how to craft canoes in very special marine cases, or knowledge of where to hide oneself or one's boat, knowledge of the island's environment, possible means of transport, were essential for planning collective maritime escapes and for crossing the sea safely and unseen. Enslaved people would also rely on their social networks, on the plantations, but also on foreign islands, when planning and executing flight attempts. These networks could also be a possible motivation for escape, as runaways attempted to reunite with friends and families. And this suggests that maritime marronage cannot be conceptualized as an abstract flight for freedom, but that pre-existing network played an important part in the motives behind running away. Furthermore, these cases suggest that we must complicate our understanding of maritime marronage by including several new actors, such as women and free Afro-Caribbeans. The fact that the two women, Mary and Mary, were involved in the planning of the escape and made contact and agreement with Sailor is remarkable. In historiography, women are not often described as the main planners and organizers of maritime marronage. Free Afro-Caribbeans and sailors must also be included and investigated when we investigate the complex and diverse networks and infrastructure surrounding maritime marronage. And that some enslaved people managed to flee by paying free Afro-Caribbeans and sailors for the crossing, that there existed this business-like infrastructure that has not been previously been explored. Maritime marronage tells an important story about slavery and freedom in the Lesser Antilles, in a region where small islands governed by different imperial authorities were so close to each other that they were in each other's field of vision. Maritime marronage was literally and metaphorically on the horizon. In their attempts to reach foreign soil, in search for freedom, friends and family or both, enslaved people actively planned their escape, and they used their knowledge, skills and networks to do so. Thank you.